Hi, I'm Lisa. This is Greenfield, and welcome to the Twins and Yields video this week.
Okay, here I am hi, I'm Lisa Neel, Twins and Needles. Here I am at the beautiful Colvin Run Mill. It's a historic mill that is run as a museum by Fairfax, Virginia County's government. And I love it here. It looks a lot like the surviving descriptions of my family's mill. And I just think it's beautiful. And later today I'm teaching spinning, not this kind of spinning, but I'm teaching spinning. And so I thought I'd dress up in my 1826 and do a little bit more conversation about Elias Boudinot. The water wheel was going and they turned it off. So I don't know if they're about to turn it on again. Anyway, so the quote that I really like about when talking about the bigger picture of the 1820s Cherokee Nation and the debate about what to do about the removal of threat is the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. This was written by Antonio Gramsci in about 1930, and it was true 100 years before that for us, because essentially, and I'll give you some links that will give you more of the actual details if you want to get into it, but the bottom line is that the 1820s and 18 teens, really, for Cherokee Nation was a version of the purge. We did not have protection from the United States government from its own people. We, in fact, kind of had negative rights compared to people, particularly in Georgia, compared to settlers. And people could come to our lands and do whatever they wanted to us, and they did. And wasn't exactly, to be fair, they weren't exactly working under federal or state orders, but they had clear protection from the state and from the federal government from prosecution for crimes they committed against us. So unfortunately, that is a playbook we see a lot throughout the world in colonialism and in settler colonial structures, and that's what happened to us. So the removal, the treaty that finalized the terms of the removal and the removal itself was kind of actually in the middle of an overall process versus the end or the beginning. And I think that's really important to understand it that way. It also wasn't happening in a vacuum. Multiple other tribes had already been removed or were under threat from removal, and we were aware of that, and we were aware of what happened to them. Several of them had extremely violent, horrifying removals. The irony is, while ours is the most famous, I think, arguably, we might have lost less people, and there's some really good scholarship that kind of argues over how many people were lost. But a moderate portion of the people who could do so had already decided to just remove themselves. There was also a portion of people who moved themselves kind of under muster, under kind of supervision of the United States government. And then the third wave was people who were forced by soldiers. So that progressively gets worse, right? So if you move yourself and you've got resources to do that, you generally make it. If you move yourself kind of under wagon trains, there's a certain amount of death and loss you would expect from that versus the actual forced removal, which was, the worst. And honestly, probably started with the sickest and poorest people. We want to acknowledge the possibility that people were not necessarily resisting to end up in that third wave. They might have just had no choice, just like how people of modern day are told, hey, you need to evacuate, there's a storm coming, there's fires coming, XYZ is happening, and they don't leave. They don't evacuate. Sometimes it's because they can't, for whatever reason. And I think it's also important to acknowledge that these different paths of resistance or acceptance or like cooperation, and I guess the word would also be like these various levels of cooperation versus resistance also fit within Cherokee traditional self-sovereignty. So even if your overall tribe or your overall family had decided on something, it was pretty normal to just do your own thing if you didn't agree with it. One example of that was Nancy Ward is actually counted by the Daughters of the American Revolution as one of the ancestors you can use to become a member of the DAR, because while Cherokee Nation as a whole was allied with the King of England throughout the Revolution, Nancy specifically warned and helped the people who became Americans after the Revolution during that war, during that conflict. So it's complicated.
George Gibson was the Commissary General of Subsistence, serving in President Jackson's Department of War, kind of the mega quartermaster. He was in charge of supplying and managing the removals of the Indian tribes from the eastern United States. As Claudio Sant puts it, which, by the way, is a book you should absolutely read if you're interested in this, he had a desire for unwavering compliance with regulations, instructed officers who were in the field dispossessing, corralling, and conducting families hundreds of miles west to fold their paper uniformly, to keep a detailed record of every fact connected with deportation. Ultimately, he required of his soldiers the most rigid economy, Sant notes. In the context of deporting 80,000 people from their homes, insistence on austerity and compliance seems like a bizarre inversion of priorities. The removals even bled into the implementation of federal provisions for health care to Indians. In 1833, the Secretary of War, Lewis Cass, passed on a report by Albert Herring to the House of Representatives describing his work in providing smallpox vaccines to various tribes. The whole report can be read on the link we have below. He writes, "The Indians uniformly, when uninfluenced by others, rightly appreciated the object of the government in offering them this preventative against a loathsome and fatal disease. To some of the tribes, the benefits have not been extended. The interest felt by some Indians in the negotiation of treaties, the preparations of others for removal west of the Mississippi, can slow the progress of the physicians and limit their labors. The removals were already authorized by Congress and signed by the president when the Cherokee Nation took the state of Georgia to the Supreme Court. The discussion among Cherokees about this is documented in the Cherokee Phoenix, which published 260 issues of a national newspaper under the titles Cherokee Phoenix and then Cherokee Phoenix, an Indian's Advocate from 1828 to 1834. Is it better to go or stay? Is there even a choice? You may have an idea that there was a Supreme Court case about the Cherokee removal. There were two, sort of. I recommend you look it up yourself, and we have posted sources below. But the second case was Worcester versus Georgia. Heard in 1832, the American missionary Worcester sued Georgia, arguing that they did not have the jurisdiction to punish him for living among the Cherokee without a license from Georgia. He was not a citizen of the state of Georgia. He was living among the Cherokee as a citizen of a different state. The court found for him, saying that we had retained our original natural rights as the undisputed possessors of this soil from time immemorial. So that's settled, right? Georgia has no authority in the Cherokee Nation, right? We could decide to stay, right?
My dear brother, you will, before this reaches you, have heard of the decision of the Supreme Court of the United States in favor of Mr. Worcester and Butler and against the state of Georgia. It is glorious news. The laws of the state are declared by the highest judicial tribunal in the country null and void. It is a great triumph on the part of the Cherokee, so far as the question of their rights were concerned. The question is forever settled as to who is right and who is wrong. And the controversy is exactly where it ought to be, and where we have all along always desirous it should be. It is not now between the great state of Georgia and the poor Cherokees, but between the U.S. and the state of Georgia, or between the friends of the judiciary and the enemies of the judiciary. We can only look and see whoever prevails in this momentous crisis. Expectation has, for the last few days, been upon tiptoe. Fears and hopes alternately took possession of our minds until, 2 or 3 hours ago, Mr. John Tappan came in to see us and asked us whether we could not dine with him tomorrow. He said his brother had just arrived in the city from Washington, and he supposed we were prepared to hear bad news. A chill went through my heart. Mr. Ridge observed, "No, we are not prepared." He then told us of the true state of the case and produced a paper which contained an account and tried to read to us, but he was so agitated with joy he could hardly proceed. A few minutes after, Mr. Anderson came in to congratulate me on the happy news. Soon after, Dr. Beecher came. I asked him whether he had heard the news from Washington. He said, "No, what is it?" I told him the Supreme Court had decided in favor of the missionaries. He jumped up, clapped his hands, and took hold of my hand and said, "God be praised," and ran right out to tell his daughter and his family. These little incidents manifest the feeling, the intense feeling on that question, and I will take upon myself to say that this decision of the court will now have a most powerful effect on public opinion. It creates a new era on the Indian question. Your letter found me very feeble. I am better now, although I have not been out of the house the last 4 days. In consequence of my illness, I've been obliged to give up my appointments at Salem and Newburyport. Nor was I able to attend a meeting held in the city last evening. I understand it was a very full meeting. Brother Franklin Gold has come all the way from New Hampshire to see me. He came in last evening from the meeting, will be in this morning, and go with me to Salem. I am sorry I grew to think many of our countrymen are betraying our country. Let us hold fast to our integrity. Tell Harriet I have written to her almost every week, and generally very long letters. Publish nothing in regard to the presidential election, about Clay or Jackson, and copy little of what's said about the Supreme Court. A great deal will be said, but let us only look on and see. I shall write again soon. Tell Harriet I do behave myself.
So I got this version of this letter from the book Cherokee Cavaliers, written by Edward Everett Dale and Gaston Lytton. It's a really fascinating document. It's one of the ones where I kind of warn people, be sure you're comfortable with the priorities of the authors here. I'll get into that more in video 3. But frustratingly, while this book is phenomenally, lovingly footnoted, there is no explanation for what he means by "tell Harriet I do behave myself." And since Harriet was literally a Puritan mystic, that could mean like he hasn't played cards, he hasn't gone dancing, he hasn't been drinking. But I'm like, what was she worrying about? I'm dying to know. And I went through one of the books of her family's correspondence, and unfortunately the correspondence between her and Elias in this period did not appear to survive. If anyone knows where to find this stuff, for the love of God, you need to tell me, because I just desperately want to know what Harriet thought behaving himself means. So I don't know if there's a word for irony when you're reading a historical document and you know that the person celebrating this wonderful thing is wrong, and it did not turn out as he wanted it to or believed it would. And here is 1841 John Ross to remind you that this is not what happened. The Supreme Court ruling about Worcester versus Georgia did not fix these problems and did not even slow down the pace of what happened to us in the removal following the signing of the New Echota Treaty and the deadlines that it set up.
But I think it's also really important to recognize that while Elias and his colleagues and friends and family and the treaty party signed this treaty, which basically didn't necessarily make the removal happen. Their argument was the removal was going to happen anyway. And anyone who didn't acknowledge that was either misinformed or incorrect or lying. And you could argue that that might have been correct, but they were negotiating the specific terms. It's a really fascinating document to really look through. I recommend that you look through it. Some of the terms of it honestly never got honored or were honored decades later. So there's that. But I think the important thing is while Elias and most of his peers in this treaty negotiation did pay the ultimate price for doing that, it didn't end the conflict and the stress that we were under. Bottom line, we were living under the American Empire. We were not going to escape it. You cannot escape the American Empire. And as a Cherokee in the 1820s, you cannot get away. You can negotiate, you can collaborate, you can bargain, but you can't escape. There's no escape from the Americans. And there's differences in opinion about how to manage that, if it could be managed, continued. Even after those killings, there was a civil war about it. The reports from the Indian agents back to the president talk about Cherokee troubles and Cherokee unrest. And it's a lot of really floral 19th century language for posse and murders and theft. And the unresolved jurisdiction and miscegenation issues that were key to that unrest continued up until statehood, up through statehood, I would argue. It's led directly to the Going Snake massacre and other murders and conflicts all the way through up until our sovereignty was briefly taken from us. So I think another really important element of this, though, when you're looking at the 1820s and 30s in Cherokee history, is that the losers wrote the story. Elias served as both an exceptional success and a warning. His family's writings and his writings have been kept, published, wrestled over by both Cherokee and non-Cherokee historians this whole time, since the 1820s, so for 200 years. This is partly because he wrote a lot. Also, his first wife, Harriet, wrote a lot and wrote a lot to her family, who were able to keep things. They were in Connecticut. I feel like also it has to do with the settler colonial gaze, right? So Elias fits a lot of our 1820s and 30s cultural assumptions about what it meant to be a romantic person, a tragic genius. And when you read the reports about him, some of which I read excerpts from in the last video, they use the same language to talk about Elias that they do when they're talking about conflict between settlers and other Native people. And so in this case, Elias is the stand-in for the settlers. He's the stand-in for the Americans. And then his family and his community are the opposing force. The element to that that's really fascinating is that he was an exceptional Indian and he had white heritage by the reckoning of settler colonialists. And you know what American historians love? A conveniently dead genius who has white heritage. They cannot get enough of that. They love it when he has a grandpappy who's white, and then he's a genius, and therefore, oh my God, that's because we're such geniuses. Even though when you read his own writing, he emphasizes that his mother and his mother's community raised him. He didn't really know his father. Oh, there's the wheel. Ha ha! On cue. So for more about that and that nuance, I recommend, oh, it's turning off again. I recommend the best book you'll ever read with quotes in the title, with scare quotes in the title, Mixed Blood Indians by Theda Purdue. Another book that touches on this is The Inconvenient Indian by Thomas King. I also want to be very clear, a lot of the books that I'm pointing out in this video were not written by Cherokees. Thomas King is an interesting separate rabbit hole. I can get into him some other time. But another really great book is Elias Boudinot, Cherokee and His America. Great book you need to read for kind of with a grain of salt. It's well-researched, largely respectful, even admiring. It's a little tiny book. But it focuses on his in-laws, I think due to document bias. Someone writing in the 1940s, speaking only English, or at least not Cherokee, in Connecticut, is going to have a lot of access to Harriet Gold and her family's writing, and not so much to Elias's direct communications. I also want to warn you that the author of this really likes Elias, really emphasizes how great he is, but I think also has a little bit of a fetish about imagining details of Elias's appearance in outer worlds in ways that are not necessarily supported by other evidence. So just bear that in mind. I think this guy's a little bit in love with Elias, a little bit in love with the idea of Elias, this genius cut down in his early 30s, and admires him greatly, and that's fine. But it gets a little creepy sometimes, so just bear that in mind.
I don't need to rub your faces in the horrors of the removal. It's a staple of the misery literature genre. Almost a dark joke to measure your own problems against and say, oh, it could be worse. It's tempting to compare your life of relative comfort and ease with theirs and think that the past is past. To think such things cannot happen again. When these paintings were being made and enjoyed, as Elias said, I was not born a Sausenzar in a stately dome and amid the congratulations of the great, for on a little hill in a lonely cabin, overspread by the forest oak, I first drew my breath. And in a language unknown to learned and polished nations, I learnt to lisp my fond mother's name. When these beautiful works of art were being made, enjoyed, and preserved, Elias was born, educated, fell in love, married a white Puritan, worked tirelessly as a journalist and editor, and died. Romanticized afterwards as a doomed outsider, a doomed exceptional outsider, much like the character of Othello in Shakespeare, much like the man who played him famously in the exact same era, speaking for his people and unable to change their fate. Arguably, his signature on the treaty was an excuse for his death. I think, now that I've read everything and thought about it too much, that Elias was really murdered because the treaty was not carried out as negotiated. There is nothing in this treaty about holding families in squalid concentration camps for 6 months. There's nothing in this treaty about using hostages to prompt resistors to muster. There's nothing in this treaty about an occupying army of more than 3,000 men to force the immigration of 17,000 unarmed people, men, women, and children, the old and the young, the sick and the well. the resigned, and the angry. An army requiring them to walk, except under very specific circumstances, determined by a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. This treaty did not consider the need to requisition coffin nails or pay for grave diggers. That need was created by the implementation. The bureaucrats who handled this paperwork were diligent and careful in their work. The removal files preserved in the National Archives are nearly 1,800 pages long, including letters, orders, reports, memos, petitions, invoices, returns, copies of newspaper articles. They include Order 25, issued by General Winfield Scott, Old Fuss and Feathers, one of the great American generals of his time. Unlike most of these files, it's printed so you don't need to be able to read 19th century handwriting to follow it. Although I do recommend that you learn how to read that kind of handwriting. It opens up a whole new world to you. It's on page 263 of the lovingly prepared microfilm produced by archivist Deidre Cleary in 1987, labeled as Correspondence, April 1838, July 1838. You should go check it out yourself because Ms. Cleary wrote a compassionate summary of the actual removal in the introduction. So you don't have to torment yourself with a lot of gruesome descriptions, but it's compassionate, it's correct, there's dates, there's receipts, it's the literal receipts. And it's worth reading through, even just for the scope of it. On that happy note, stay tuned for part 3 of this series. We're going to spiral back to the racialization of Cherokees in this period that is actually really well described by Boudinot's life and the discourse around him and his family. And we are also going to talk about anti-racist readings of Cherokee history and give a few more resources. I'm really pleased with the books I've been able to point to you guys to, and hopefully some of you will find it interesting and will have a look yourselves. I really encourage you to look at these materials yourself, get down to the primary sources as much as you can. I recognize there's obviously a lot of bias, especially in the federal records on the removal, but it's what we have. And those talking leaves give us a connection and a readily available, reachable connection to that broader history that in some ways can be almost clinical, can be dehumanizing, but can also reveal moments of phenomenal human connection. I found one of these reports. I was scrolling through this giant pile virtually of documents, and I found a report written in handwriting that looks just like mine. And it struck me. People did this stuff. It was people. You imagine, you want them to be monsters. You want them to be mustache twirling villains. We'll get more into that next time. But ultimately, whether they agreed with what they were doing in their deepest heart, they were people serving a policy also made by people. And the more that we recognize that, the best we can learn from it.
Oh, look. Wild Indian. But with that, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time. Hope you read the resources and explore this information yourself. There's a lot of writing about it. Just be sure to be safe. Take breaks. listen to your body. And if it's stressing out too much, put it down and put it away. It's 200 years ago. You can't change it now.